Hey guys, my name is Jordan Koss. Welcome to the Almost Essential podcast. This 16-episode series is based off my final project for my Doctorate of Ministry degree at Fuller Theological Seminary. The title of that final project is Almost Essential Evangelists, Improving Retirement Asset Accumulation for Mainstream Church of Christ Pastors. In this series, we will interview 8 different specialists in 8 separate episodes. And we will also interview 2 pastors from each of 8 different regions around the U.S. This final project was inspired by 10 years of ministry in 3 different churches of Christ from Georgia to Northern California from 2010 to 2019, as well as my time as a financial professional in training in 2020. That is where I learned about the retirement crisis America is in and will be experiencing in the coming years. Now, I have 3 goals for this podcast. 1, provide an accessible, denomination-specific qualitative conversation for Church of Christ pastors and leaders. 2, introduce leaders and listeners to retirement vehicles and strategies they may not have heard about before. And 3, provide encouragement, motivation, and knowledge to save for the last third of life. Thank you for listening and enjoy. All right, welcome once again to the Almost Essential podcast. This is episode 7. We're grateful that you are watching and listening along with this 16-episode series as we make our way through talking with special guests and with pastors from around the country about the topic of accumulating assets for retirement for Church of Christ pastors. With us today, again, is our co-host, Lars Coburn. Lars, why don't you introduce yourself a little bit?
Yeah, so here at Bushnell University in Eugene, Oregon, serve as the Church Relations Director of University Relations, and get to teach a few classes for them as an adjunct professor on managerial finance and Master of Arts in Leadership. And thinking a little bit about personal finance is something that is fun for me. My wife and I, after 8 years of doing ministry, still kind of see my life work here at the university as ministry. And so I'm invested in this topic personally. Got to know Jordan in youth ministry, and then kind of walk along as he's discovered some of these research things and finished his program. And so I'm grateful to be part of the podcast. It's kind of the fruit of his labors at Fuller Seminary, the place I got my master's as well. So glad to be part of it.
Yeah, thank you, Lars. And with us today, or this evening, rather, is our special guest, Dr. James Knapp from Southeastern Oklahoma State University. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay, so tell our audience and our viewers a little bit about yourself.
Well, I'm Jamie Knapp. I'm a sociology professor at Southeastern Oklahoma State University. This is my 27th year. I'm a graduate of Harding University twice. Not that I failed once, but a bachelor's degree and a master's degree, and then a doctorate degree in sociology from University of North Texas. And in addition to my teaching, I'm a social researcher and mostly dealing with applied topics, as I like to say, things that might have some benefit to normal people and not just be, an academic exercise. And so that's kind of been where my focus is in the research I've done.
Great. Awesome. Well, we're going to kick things off now. And so question 1 is kind of dig a little deeper, unpack a little bit more about how you came to study the subject of Church of Christ pastors and retirement as part of your work as a sociologist.
Well, I'm a lifelong member of the Church of Christ. And I've moved around some. And so I've had a chance to be with different congregations of different sizes in different parts of the country. When I came out of graduate school and first started at Southeastern, one of the things I wanted to do was, again, some applied research. My interest was aging, but also aging connected to religion, not a philosophical stance on religion, but more of just the Congregational life, perhaps would be a better way of saying it.
Okay.
And so I did some research on how congregations are responding to the aging of their members, and did some academic things, some publications and presentations with that, and then wrote a book called The Graying of the Flock.
Okay.
Published in 2003. And after that mountaintop experience, I was looking for the next topic that was somewhat related. And I'm not sure how I became aware of it, but I think the idea of doing something focused on ministers in retirement was somewhere in the mix. And so that I kind of moved in that direction, along with some other things. But that was one of the things I began to pursue.
Yeah, no, it's great. That's great. That's awesome. And the graying of the flock, what I wasn't aware that you wrote a book. That's awesome. And so what was the topics? Unpack that a little bit for us.
Well, I surveyed several hundred, primarily Church of Christ congregations. That was the basis of the survey research. And there was some qualitative research on top of that. But just, again, exploratory type of research. No one had done anything like that within Churches of Christ. There was some work outside of Churches of Christ. Yeah. And so I took my interest in and awareness of the Church of Christ, along with an interest in how churches respond to the graying of the flock or the aging of their members. And it really was a survey just focused on senior adult ministry and what churches are doing in response to and with their older members. And the subtitle is called "The Graying of the Flock: A New Model for Ministry," kind of a new approach to the new senior adult and some of the expectations that they have. And of course, that book was published 20 years ago, and so there's probably even more recent ideas that would need to be put in about expectations of senior adult ministry. So that's what that was about. And then after that was published, expanded, I thought I would focus on the baby boomers, and their view of senior adult ministry. And the more I got into that, the more I became interested in Gen X. The more I became interested in Gen X, became interested in millennials. And before I knew it, I was focusing on how churches respond to having multiple generations under the same roof. And I wrote a small book on that called Understanding the Generations. And did some speaking at churches and some academic stuff, but churches as well. And I found that churches are far more interested in understanding the generations than they were with senior adult ministry. And so that's kind of where the so.
That's funny. That's funny. Now, I came across your work due to one particular Christian Chronicle article. It's like I was trying to find something about Church of Christ research, academic research about Church of Christ pastors in retirement. And I did a Google search, finally found this link to a Christian Chronicle article where they were talking about your first study where you did, you surveyed over 200 Texas Church of Christ pastors about, their retirement realities. And that's how I came to be aware of what you have done. And then I found out about your second national study as well. And you mentioned at the beginning, I believe, of one of those articles, the problem of the void, which you've already mentioned, the problem of the void or lack of published empirical literature and research focused exclusively on the retirement experience of clergy, and I would say in Churches of Christ too, perhaps even broader, you could say maybe. Why do you think that this is the case within Churches of Christ?
What that we haven't done much research on ourselves?
Yeah.
Because we're not research oriented. That's what it comes down to. I mean, Church of Christ congregations are locally autonomous in theory. We don't really have an institutional structure that holds us in place. We have, informal things. We kind of we hover around our Christian colleges and universities, and in the past we hovered around some publications, the Firm Foundation, and things of that nature. But we don't really have an institutional body or structure. We don't have a research division, anything like that.
Okay.
And then Church of Christ colleges and universities really haven't been research oriented either. I think they're a little more now than they used to be. At least a couple of them are. But as in Church of Christ colleges and universities, have been primarily teaching institutions and teaching and matchmaking, but not a whole lot focused on research. So
yeah, 3 swings in a ring, right?
That's right.
That's right.
Oh, yeah. I just had somebody ask me about our things like that when it comes to dating and MRS degrees and all of those things. But I think you're talking about research. Part of that is we're often bent towards training pastors for ministry, and so as a sociologist, I'd be curious what you think of pastors and their tendencies toward research. Did you find in this that, or ministers, I should say, in the Churches of Christ too, do we tend to be kind of against research in your mind when it comes to these kind of topics, or I don't know, maybe that's a little bit of a weird question.
I don't know. I know that we had a respectable response rate to our surveys. You always like to have more than what you get, but when you're surveying, for instance, across the country, a lot of people don't know who you are, and so you're hoping out of the goodness of their heart or their interest in the topic that they'll respond.
Yeah.
I think some probably did not want to participate because they just, that research wasn't their thing.
Mm-hmm.
But there were actually, a lot of folks who seemed to be quite eager to respond and to include some written comments on the surveys in areas where they were asked for additional, or in some cases they put additional comments in areas they weren't asked for their comments. But so some were quite eager to share their perspective. And it seemed to be, as it relates to this topic, there seemed to be, again, at least among those who responded, an eagerness to speak on the topic.
Great. Yeah, and you started in Texas. Now, why Texas? I think we have perhaps I can imagine why you did, because it's like the Bible Belt of the Church of Christ. But is that why, or is there another reason?
Well, Tennessee and Texas are the biggest, the hotbeds of Churches of Christ, and really, you could almost lay the Church of Christ map on top of the Southern Baptist map and see the same thing. We're very strong in the South, the Southeast, and all. A lot of our churches aren't as large necessarily as Southern Baptist churches, but we're in the Bible Belt. Texas, my co-author on the first study was Jim Hughes. Jim was actually a senior adult minister in Dallas. He was one of the few folks who was fully employed to do senior adult ministry. Jim has a doctorate from Nebraska, and was eager to be involved in some research, but because of his work, he was much more of a practitioner. He just didn't have time or resources to do research. So when I approached him about joining and being a part of the research, he was very eager to do that. And for whatever reason, we chose Texas. Sometimes when you first study something, you want to do a pilot study to work out any wrinkles, any kinks that you might have in your survey. And so we thought, well, it's probably better if we started in Texas than if we started this in New Hampshire, where we would end up surveying just a couple dozen.
Yeah.
So that's how we, I think, ended up in Texas.
Great. Yeah, and so your 2 studies were published in 2009 and 2017, and you focused on housing and financial preparedness and how they impacted Churches of Christ pastors' decision to either fully, partially, or not retire at all. To achieve this, you asked them 4 questions. Your third question was most relevant to my study, what I'm doing with Fuller. And that third question was, what sources of income are available to members of the clergy? What did you find pertaining to that question in the first, second, in both studies?
A very heavy reliance on Social Security, which, I'm not sure that's unique to ministers. I think if you look across the country, that's an issue. I think younger folks have recognized the need to go outside of Social Security, but there was a heavy reliance on Social Security. And then just sort of I offered several different options, and I was just asking them to indicate whether they had that or did not have that. Right. And, I think there were two of the categories where more than half of the respondents said, yes, I have that. And that it threw up some red flags, and some alarm bells went off, because that's people don't live off of Social Security in their retirement anymore. Once upon a time they might have, but that's just not enough. There were a few ministers who came from another career, and so they already had a pension in place, and that was going to help them. Some were going to rely on the retirement income of their spouse. Mm-hmm. She had a job and was going to get a pension or have some sort of thing. And then there was also there was a noticeable percentage of respondents who were living in a house provided by the church, and that was very alarming, because that's when you mix a heavy reliance on Social Security and the absence of any home equity when one enters their retirement years, that's a recipe for some problems financially.
Yeah. Lars, you have follow-up?
Yeah. So, Jamie, I'm curious, as you were doing this study, and then maybe branching out to some of your anecdotal, research of just the churches you are familiar with, did you come across any demographic information that would say, ministers are kind of staying in the pulpit longer than maybe the generations in the past that maybe were almost delaying? And I know, at least my anecdotal experience in Southern California was that we had pastors kind of in the pulpit 10 plus years longer. And there was kind of this group of Generation X, the Xer generation, that were either associates longer, or, coming to the pulpit later, or even exiting ministry because there weren't any open pulpits for them. I don't know that because we haven't done the research for it, but I was just curious if you noticed anything that was similar to that anecdotal experience that I had.
No, but that's not really where my focus was. I don't question what you're saying, but I really didn't have anything in the study that focused on that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. A follow-up to the second question that I forgot to ask is that I didn't find much other than your two studies. Is there anything else that you're aware of other than your two studies in terms of academic research on the subject for Churches of Christ?
Not that I'm aware of. No, yeah. I've not looked as recently as you probably have. You're in the middle of working on, your doctoral research. You're probably very familiar with what's available, but I'm not. Okay. The Abilene Christian University has their annual salary survey, right, out of which there's some information focused on retirement. But sociologists in the Church of Christ are like birds that swim and fish that fly. There just aren't very many of us.
But we need you guys.
Yeah, but sociology has such a reputation as being liberal that sometimes it doesn't fit real well with the more conservative approach our Christian Church of Christ colleges and universities have.
Yeah, that's unfortunate. Have you gotten any kind of negative pushback at all in your experience?
No, I've not. But when I was coming out of graduate school, I think there were 5 PhDs in sociology who were affiliated with the Church of Christ. Okay. And that number may have gone up a little bit, but then some of those folks have since retired. So there just aren't very many of us. And so, what I think is the unique angle we bring of being able to do solid survey research in particular is there just aren't a whole lot of folks who do that.
Right. Yeah. 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 I wasn't able to find anything else besides your two studies, and maybe there is something. I'm just a bad researcher, but I don't know. I couldn't find anything else. So that's a very well maybe the case. I'm just bad at researching. But
I don't think so. I think you would know
yeah,
if it was out there.
yeah, and I think I would think that you would kind of be aware of other things as well, and that kind of tells me there really isn't. At what I found, which is nothing, is I guess there is nothing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so question 4. You mentioned
just real quick
go
on
ahead.
that,
Yeah.
Jordan, before we get into the next bit, so Jamie, what would be a suggestion you might have for a autonomous congregational movement that is loosely affiliated with itself? 1906 or whatever, we get told by the U.S. government we're going to be on the census differently.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not even sure we were really paying that close of attention to that stuff. Is it through the Christian colleges? Is it through some other entity? How would we promote scholarship and communication better in your mind? Just as kind of an observation from a sociologist's point of view.
You mean in terms of social research?
Yeah, I think
there are obviously there are people who are doing research now at Church of Christ colleges and universities, but this particular kind of research, I think just because there aren't very many of us, PhD trained sociologists, it probably would take someone who had the credential and who had a position at one of the colleges to really be the champion of it. The second author on the second study, Charlie Pruett, was at Abilene Christian University, and he has since retired, I think, at least from full-time and maybe completely retired. But he was the director of the Pruett Gerontology Center. And because he had a PhD in sociology, we've been friends for many years, he was a great resource because, he had some institutional support, and he had a bit of a platform, at least in terms of the study of aging. And he had a good affiliation with the College of Biblical Studies. And Charlie himself had been a missionary before he decided to go into graduate school. So someone like that could really be the champion of a cause like this, but I'm not sure who the next person is going to be to step into that role.
Yeah. Lars, go right ahead, man.
No.
Go get a PhD.
Yeah, I don't know about that. But, I think of this as like where Pepperdine has partnered with Barna on different research projects.
Yeah.
And I know as I'm getting more familiar with the Disciples of Christ and their work but they, of course, have this structure and some of these things that we don't necessarily have. So I think it's a unique challenge that even our Christian colleges may struggle to fill because our churches are not, as affiliated with each other. So I appreciate your thought there, but I was just curious. So yeah, question 4.
Okay, great. Question 4. You mentioned that you found very similar results between your pilot study in Texas and your national study and across the country. So what were those very similar results between the pilot and the national study?
Well, on a without digging through every single line of the study of the article, again, just the I would call it the lack of a three-legged stool of retirement income.
Okay.
And that's, from gerontologists and probably from, retirement advisors and things of that nature. They talk about the three-legged stool of retirement. And basically that means that for a person to be on solid footing for retirement income, they need Social Security.
Right.
That's typically one leg. They need some sort of a pension. Perhaps they're in a kind of job that still has a pension plan, or a 401k, 403b, IRA, something like that would be a second leg. And then they need something else. They need, a plump
Personal
savings
savings.
account. They need income from rental property that they may have acquired, something like that. And that creates the third leg.
Yeah.
If one of those legs is missing, well, you know what happens if you have a three-legged stool and it only has two legs. Well, then it's very uneven. It's a constant challenge to keep things balanced. And so I think that was the biggest thing that emerged out of it. More specifically, again, pretty heavy reliance on Social Security and what seemed to be some underdeveloped options in other retirement vehicles. And then the thing I kept coming back to was what I considered to be a really disturbing pattern of still a noticeable percentage of preachers who were living in housing provided by the church. Not that they were getting a housing allowance to pay for the house they purchased, but they were actually living in, what many would call the parsonage.
Right.
And the problem there is that, you're missing out on a golden opportunity to save for retirement. And then there's also that crisis of what happens when that individual is no longer the preacher or the pastor at that church, and they have to move out of the parsonage. They don't have a place to live. They've not built any equity. And if they're getting close to retirement age, they really don't have time to catch up either.
Right. I've experienced that firsthand. A parsonage in Silicon Valley is super helpful because housing is so expensive. But when you transition out of ministry in the Silicon Valley and try to then go into a house, I mean, that situation for me was very challenging to make that transition. Yeah. And so, Lars, any thought on that, on what he just had to say?
Yeah, no, I think the three-legged stool thing you brought up earlier, the equity thing, and having some real assets. I think where we've kind of focused our discussion has been on this idea of Social Security and then the pension idea, and how maybe even within that model that churches often model after, they're not modeling after the old pension model where the onus is on the organization to care for the pastor, but on the individual to contribute and those kind of things. So I'd be curious, in your study, did you do any sort of research about churches matching or churches bearing that burden at all, or was it just strictly on the pastor and his kind of role? I haven't read your study, so I'm not familiar.
Yeah, well, I did not. Both really were exploratory studies. The first, the pilot study, and then even the second study, though it was branched out into other states, it really was still exploratory. Yeah. And apparently no one has decided to move beyond the exploratory stage and do additional research with it. But that's a great question. I don't know if the ACU salary survey touches on that. And again, there may be, coming out of Harding or Freed-Hardeman or Lipscomb or Pepperdine, there may be some smaller, perhaps non-representative surveys that are being done that are quite asking that question. I don't know the answer to that, but I think it's a great question. What as a part of a minister's compensation package, is there some sort of a contribution to a retirement fund?
They have an aspect of retirement, the package, is part of their survey, but I can't answer that completely correctly because it's been a while since I've looked at it. But there is something related to retirement, they receive it or not, in the ACU salary survey. And just for specifics, it was 214 Church of Christ pastors in Texas, and then the national study was 207 Church of Christ pastors from around the country. And in the pilot study and in the national study, you found that in both 28.7% had no plan to fully retire, which you said a common theme was that was a reason because of inadequate financial base, in part due to a low salary and living in church-owned homes. Can you expound any more than you already have on that at all?
Well, in addition to the closed-ended questions that were in the survey, there were also some places to add comments, and again, this would have to be considered anecdotal, but there were there are respondents who indicated, I can't afford to retire. I simply have not had the opportunity to accumulate enough resources to be able to support myself in retirement, which kind of goes back to a larger issue. I mean, when we think about retirement, first of all, 100 years ago, only the extremely wealthy retired. In fact, they probably never worked to begin with, but retirement just wasn't a phase of life.
Sure.
And Social Security ushered in the idea of, you mean I can work, and then when I get into my 60s, I can not work anymore and still get paid. And so that ushered in this idea of retirement being a phase of life.
Yeah.
But for that to work, we have to earn a lot of money from our early 20s to our early 60s, because we have to pay our bills and support ourselves while we're working, while at the same time trying to make enough money to set aside so that we can have income when we're not working. Well, if you don't get paid very much, then you need all the money you make right now to pay the bills right now. And the idea of saving for retirement is a wonderful concept, but it just isn't realistic. And so folks who don't get paid very much, including preachers who don't get paid very much, they just aren't in a position to prepare themselves for retirement.
Yeah, you're absolutely correct on that. Yeah, and Ghilarducci says it's a majority of Americans that are going to be facing this kind of retirement crisis as a result of what she says, a broken retirement system and traditional retirement vehicles that simply just have failed. They aren't doing what we want them to do or are using them for. And one of the things that she says is precipitating this DIY retirement crisis is the switch from pension to 401k, which took the responsibility from the employer providing the pension, defined benefit, to the 401k, which is the responsibility of the employee. And her conclusions are that the 401k is just a 40-year experiment, but it's also a 40-year failure. And she says that's the number one cause, because we're using actually a vehicle that was created that was never intended to be used for retirement, which says she goes into a lot more in one of her books called Rescuing Retirement. And I based my study off of her basic, hey, here's the problem. How do we solve it? But in question 6, you mentioned that a primary implication of both studies was the need for pre-retirement education for pastors and for churches to take clergy retirement more seriously, which includes shifting away from outdated compensation models, the 20th century compensation models. What do you mean by that?
Well, the outdated compensation model being, and again, this is very, very, very popular in smaller churches. We can't really afford to pay you a lot, but we can pay you a small salary, and you can live in this nice house without paying any rent, and we'll cover the utilities.
Right.
And again, as long as you're employed, that's not a bad option, I suppose. But when you're no longer with the church, where are you going to live? And so you miss out on the opportunity to build equity. I was looking the other day at some information, and it's a couple years old, but for the typical homeowner over the age of 65, they have close to $145,000 on average of equity in their home that they can tap into. Obviously, some have more than that, some have less. Well, if you spent your whole life living in a parsonage or not owning your own home, you're missing out on a really important piece of income or potential income during one's retirement years. And so that becomes a problem as well. So that the outdated model is, rather than compensating in a more generous way, kind of hoping that the preacher will take it and see the house that they get to live in for free as part of their compensation, and consider that to be fair compensation for the work that they were doing.
And your estimation, was that fair compensation or no?
Was it fair? Well, I think in reality, that's probably about all that some churches could do.
Yeah.
You probably know this, but roughly 70% of Church of Christ congregations have fewer than 100 people in attendance.
Right.
Roughly 90% of Church of Christ congregations have fewer than 200 people in attendance. And those are pre-COVID numbers.
Yeah.
And so there are a lot of churches that simply don't have the resources and never have had the resources. And we can see really large Church of Christ congregations in Dallas and Oklahoma City and Atlanta and Nashville. Things like that. And they're not representative of our fellowship as a whole. We are a very small and historically rural fellowship, which goes back to what Lars had mentioned, the 1906 shift in census and sort of recognizing the separation of disciples of Christ from the Church of Christ. Well, when that happened, one of the realities was the Church of Christ got a lot of the small rural congregations that kind of fell under our banner, and more of the urban, not exclusively, but more of the urban congregations, went with the Disciples of Christ group. And so, I going back to your question, is it fair? Probably not, but it may be all that was available.
Yeah.
It's interesting because Jordan and I, similar time periods, both in churches in California, but my eldership took a stance to give us compensation that would allow us to live in other parts of the city, and they then charged us market rate rent. And so I actually had a sticker price that was more than what I'm paying for my mortgage. I have a 1,800 square foot mortgage in Oregon now, and it's cheaper than my rent to the church I was working at that was 600 square feet in California. So it was a little bit strange, but of course that's California prices versus Oregon prices. But I do appreciate now a little bit looking in the rearview mirror, because at the time I thought, you guys are ridiculous. You should be giving me a discounted rate, on this church-owned apartment. But I understand the heart and the desire for them not to let that become a crutch for them. And they did increase my salary to try and keep pace with that. I pulled up the ACU survey results from 2022. Of course, it's not, I'm not looking at everything in it, but I did scroll down and find the benefits section. And I thought it was interesting. There's a percentage of those that responded to the survey that don't have any retirement benefit from the church. And it said 63%, which is in keeping with the numbers we've been talking about on here. And I thought it was interesting that the average amount of those with this benefit was $2,900, which is, that's not a small amount, but it's still not very much when we're talking about contribution to retirement. So I just thought I would bring that in.
No, thanks.
As we were talking about it already, but
I have it in my paper. I just couldn't recollect it, but thanks for pulling that up and letting us know. That's good. Okay. And so when you say pre-retirement education for pastors, do you have anything particular in mind? Or you just say in general, they really need this?
Many years ago, this is back from the 70s, Conrad Glass published a study on just various things about pastors and job satisfaction and things of that nature. And I think there was even some discussion there of some pre-retirement education. Of course, it's very dated, not specific to Churches of Christ. I don't know that I have anything in particular, any specifics that needed to be discussed, but I would probably say that the pre-retirement education should also be provided to the eldership in the churches to let them see the reality of what their preacher, their pastor, their minister might face in the future. And of course, it's rare that a preacher is going to come to a church and stay for 40 years. But perhaps if the eldership was aware of some of the financial realities that someone who commits their life to ministry, they might take a different approach. And again, this is something that would probably be handled best by say a school like Abilene Christian University, since they have the salary survey, they're touching on some retirement things that, creating some form of retirement education for preachers and for elders might be a worthwhile endeavor.
Yeah, great, awesome. Okay, so in both studies, like you've already mentioned, you revealed that COC pastors have a strong over-reliance on traditional retirement vehicles, Social Security, and the other one was IRAs, which you said were the primary sources of income for them in retirement, and the only sources of income that broke that 50% utilization, like over 50% of participants, they're relying on those two things. And those were the only things that over 50% of those participants were relying on. So that was, concerning. And this falls in line with Ghilarducci's research on how Americans are over-reliant on insufficient traditional vehicles, which she says is precipitating what she calls the American DIY retirement crisis. So based upon your study, it seems like Church of Christ pastors are a microcosm of this DIY retirement crisis coined by Ghilarducci. What are your thoughts on that?
I've not read any of her work in detail.
Yeah.
I know she's published a lot. I'm sure very, very well respected, and probably knows a whole lot more about that than I do. In some ways, though, I think being in ministry is unique and might deserve its own category when considering retirement income and retirement options and motivations for retirement, things of that nature. And you guys know, because you've been in full-time ministry. What I have is anecdotal by talking to folks who have been, in some cases, for many years in ministry. To be in full-time ministry has this unique combination of calling and vocation. And I know that in Churches of Christ, we've not been real fond of the expression of being called to ministry, but I think a lot of folks who enter the ministry feel drawn to it, even if they don't want to use the word calling. They feel like it's something that they were meant to do. And so that, I think, in some ways separates ministers from accountants and from coal miners and other folks who have a job. But those who are in ministry sometimes feel called to that. And yet in the middle of their calling, it's also their job. It's also their vocation. It's also the way that they're going about making their money to be able to provide for themselves and for their family. And so when one considers, retirement income models and all the various things that go into that, it's almost as if, things that are being published and are very solid in their own right might need to be tweaked slightly to be more applicable to those who are in an area like full-time ministry.
Okay. Lars, any follow-up to what we've been talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right to have that instinct that there's something more to the work that we're doing, that the passion, the kind of desire to just throw ourselves into the den, or into the fire, and not count the cost. Maybe we're drawn to not be in this for the money. Obviously, I mean, there are definitely those outliers where people get into ministry because they think that they can't do anything else. But I feel that tug of to say, well, this is my ministry, this is my mission, this is how I'm serving God, and I didn't get into it for retirement, or I didn't get into it to be safe, and so we can easily become biased towards putting pastors into mental health problems or anxiety problems or codependency behavior, which, I mean, I'm projecting that a little bit too much onto the parsonage idea, but I think there's some things there where we can, in helping industries like being a minister, we can quickly blur those lines, and it can be dangerous. I think retirement is again, for me, a helpful way we give permission to ministers to say, you don't have to be constantly doing into your 70s, 80s. You are still useful to the church and useful to the kingdom of God, past the time when maybe you can't hold your Bible anymore, and speak from the pulpit. So we want to make sure that you can flourish and contribute to the kingdom of God in other ways. And I think retirement is part of that. So, but I also lean towards Ghilarducci's thing of seeing this DIY crisis. And so I'd be curious from are you familiar with any, or have you done any bigger research projects on retirement or debt that don't have to do with Church of Christ ministers? Has your work as a sociologist kind of entered into that sphere outside of ministers?
No, I've focused on aging or generations in the churches, and just kind of gone in different directions around that hub. So I've not moved outside of that. Largely, if I could follow up on something that you said, if we go back to the calling versus vocation idea, one of the things that I think pre-retirement education could tell someone who's in full-time ministry is it's okay at some point to retire from the vocation of preaching, but you can still remain committed to your calling as a minister. And in results from the surveys, I think particularly the second study, there were a few folks who wrote that. So I'm never going to retire. I can't retire because you don't retire from working for the Lord. You don't retire from ministry. And that helped to trigger my thought of, but you can retire from the job. You can retire from going, and doing many of the tasks that most of us who sit in the pews or whatever kind of seating we have in the auditorium or sanctuary. I think many of us don't understand fully what someone who's involved in full-time ministry does Monday through Friday. We know they're busy on Sundays, but we're not real sure what they do the rest of the week. And like any kind of job, you can get tired of doing those tasks that are attached to ministry, and tasks being separate from the actual ministry to people and helping people.
One sociologist I am aware of, by the name of Lisa Keister at Duke, did a study called Conservative Protestants and Wealth, and she found that conservative Protestants, which includes Church of Christ, are asset poor, and particularly asset poor in retirement, because they have this the way they think about retirement is in some sense like it's not important, or they have a negative view of retirement, and saving for retirement is not important. And her findings can be found, her study can be found online. At least I found it for free. And she has written on this subject in other places as well. But I found that to be interesting. Like, okay, what is it about the sociological origins of Churches of Christ that perhaps has led us to be where we're at in terms of heavy reliance on Social Security and IRAs and not much more, to offer parsonages and the compensation models and such, and for us to think about retirement in this way, to the point where, we are a microcosm of that retirement crisis. So, I found her research to be interesting as well. Number 8, guys, question number 8. The most notable difference, and we've talked about parsonages already and the negative effects of that, but you said the most notable difference between the two studies was that fewer were living in a parsonage. In the national study, it was 15% in the national study versus 32% in the Texas pilot study. Why do you think that was the case in terms of that difference?
I don't have a clear answer to that. I'd have to go back and look at some of the characteristics of the respondents. When we did both studies, we used a probability sample. We used Churches of Christ in the United States as our sampling frame, and what we tried to do is we tried to include in our sample churches that fit into the demographics I'd mentioned earlier. In other words, we didn't just survey churches where they had 500 people in attendance and describe this rosy situation. We tried to tap into the smaller churches because that's what most of the churches of Christ are. They have attendance under 100 people on a typical Sunday. It's possible that when we did the national study, that those who completed the survey and sent it back may have come from some larger churches. I believe we sent out more surveys in the national study than we did in the pilot study, and so there could have been some sampling bias in terms of well, not sampling bias, but response bias in terms of those who chose to respond. But outside of that, I really don't have a good explanation. I'm not sure what I just said was a good explanation, but it's at least a possibility of how those numbers were different.
Yes. Out of the 3 churches that I worked for within the 10 years within Church of Christ, and I was born and raised Church of Christ, there 3 days a week, and every time the doors were open. But out of the 3 churches I worked for in Columbus, Georgia, and Central Valley, California, and Bay Area, California, I only lived in a parsonage once, and that was in the Silicon Valley. And when you move to the Silicon Valley, you're like, it's almost like you breathe a sigh of relief because, there's a parsonage, thank goodness, because it's so expensive to live here. But then again, it's like, what do you do, like you're saying, when you're not in ministry anymore? It was a tough situation.
If I could just jump in, and again, I'm approaching this as a researcher, and I'm seeing, if we're still focusing on the preacher's going to live in a parsonage, from the perspective of many ministers, that might actually be a good thing if that was offered to them. Of, hey, I get a house to sign me up for it. But again, from the perspective that we were looking at of retirement, it's on the other end. When you come to the end of your career, if you've moved from parsonage to parsonage, not only have you not built any equity, that's the financial side of it, but the more immediate crisis is when the last church tells you, we don't need you anymore, where do you live?
Yeah.
Yeah,
exactly.
So I'd be curious, a place to look also would be, as assets have declined in Churches of Christ, how many parsonages were sold in the last 20 years. And your studies were about 10 years apart, almost 10 years apart. And that comes to my mind, as I know several churches who sold their properties or were selling their parsonages sometimes. Now, the 2 churches I was a part of still own theirs, but I do know that's been a piece of the conversation as well, is assets being sold off. I know several universities have been paying attention to that. How do we step into this conversation? Where is that money going? Where are those properties going? And I'm sure sometimes it's out of selfish interest on the university side. But.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good thought. Lars, we do need to look into that a little bit more, perhaps if we can find somebody to bring on the podcast to talk about that, and that I think you've mentioned before. Question number 9, you found 2 clear patterns from both studies. And the first pattern was those who minister at larger churches are in a better position to fully retire than those at smaller congregations. And number 2, pastors with no plan to retire were older, work with smaller churches, and have been in ministry longer than those planning to fully retire. What do you draw out of those 2 clear patterns and similarities?
Well, we've, I think, touched on this throughout our conversation. Yeah. Larger congregations have more resources, typically. And with those, with more resources, they're able to do more things, and they're able to attract, for lack of a better way of saying it, the better preachers, the more popular preachers. They can pay them more. They can provide some fringe benefits that other churches don't provide. And so I think that's where that would come. And also I would suggest that in some cases, the elders at larger congregations may have a slightly better understanding of some of the realities, the financial realities of life, now, paying bills now, but also towards the future. And so there's that. Among those who were older, working with smaller churches, been in ministry longer, we could probably talk in a lot of directions about that. We did not cross-tabulate, but I'm willing to say that many of those ministers lacked a college degree in terms of a preaching degree. Yeah. They may have gone to a preaching school and got some training in that way, or they might simply be they built some sermons over the years and just tried to continue growing in that way. But once they got slotted in working with the smaller churches, and being slotted might just have been because of where they were geographically.
Right.
If you're in the northeastern part of the United States and you're going to be in ministry in Churches of Christ, you're going to be working with small churches. That's just the reality of it. Northwest is the same thing. You get into the Bible Belt, you improve the chances of being with a larger church, but there are plenty of small rural congregations in the Bible Belt.
Oh, yeah.
We simply don't have the resources. And so I think once the pattern gets started, and a person begins to see they're getting close to the point where they're not going to be able to, be in full-time ministry anymore, and some of the realities begin to hit them about a lack of financial preparation, then, they've got to keep trying to find a way to stay employed. And then there's the reality that they might face some ageism, that the churches don't want an old preacher. And that's a really tough spot to be in, because you don't have very many resources financially for your retirement, and you can't get a full-time job with parsonage. And so now you're really in a bad spot.
Yeah. I know in my experience, I started out in the Deep South, Columbus, Georgia, and that congregation was about 250, and they didn't offer any compensation packages in terms of retirement benefits. Then when I moved out to California, larger churches, better compensation packages, including retirement. So that was just my experience, which is interesting. Outside the Bible Belt, I got better compensation, but they were also larger congregations. Lars, I don't know what it was your experience was.
Yeah, so the small church up here in the Pacific Northwest was where I was doing part-time ministry while I was in college, and they were not doing much in terms of compensation packages. They had a part-time pulpit minister. Then we were kind of involved in the time where they went and searched for a full-time one. I think my dad was on the eldership, so he was bringing a different perspective to those guys, having been in part of churches that had better packages in the past. But then moving to Southern California, a larger church in that area, 350, they had a retirement package, health insurance, and they had 3 parsonages. So, 3, is that right? No, they had 2. They had 2 parsonages. But I wasn't one of the ministers that was in one, because I was the low man on the totem pole. I like to say youth minister is so far down on the totem pole, when the dog lifts his leg to pee on, he pees right in your face. Jordan's now regretting that I'm on the podcast.
No.
But anyway, yeah, it was interesting. So then moved to another church that was smaller, but in LA, and they didn't have any sort of benefit package. They were relying on spouse at the time. One of the ministers, his spouse was making quite a bit and had full, really good benefit package. My wife was working for the school district, same thing. Okay. So over reliance on spousal benefit package, in my mind. When my first child was born, we stopped. My wife stopped working full time, so that pushed them to do a lot of research and up our compensation, as well as health insurance stipend. And then retirement was on the table for conversation, but they were both self-employed elders. And so I think that's also a microcosm that you were talking about, mentioning that I don't think it's malicious behavior by any means. I think these are just realities. Like, these two guys had never had an employer take care of them. They didn't have health insurance or retirement. And so they kind of were treating me like a 1099 contractor, because they were 1099 contractors in every job that they've been a part of. And so, that's something to take into consideration too, is our probably doing some research on the sociology of our elderships, and not just the ministers that serve in our churches, but who are the elders that end up leading these churches, and probably in these rural settings. It's different than in those more urban, larger churches.
Yeah. Okay. Another question for you, and we're winding down our conversation tonight. And that is, what did the fully retired group have in common? And was there a big difference between the fully retired group in both studies and those who were partially or no retire group?
Well, as a general statement, those who were able to say, yes, I'm planning to retire, and could talk with some specifics about when the retirement would occur, they had been in a better situation, and they had been able to, either on their own or perhaps with their spouse and her employment, they had resources that just weren't going to be available to those who are going to partially retire or not retire at all. And I think, again, going back to something I'd mentioned just a moment ago, I think there existed among some of the respondents the idea that I'm in ministry, I can't retire. People who are in ministry don't retire. You don't retire from doing the Lord's work. And I'm not sure they again recognize the distinction between their vocation and their calling. Anyone who claims to be a Christian is in ministry, and none of us retire from that. But that doesn't mean we can't retire from our job, whatever our job happens to be. And some people, their job is preacher. And so, those who said, well, I'm going to partially retire, maybe they were trying to find the balance between, I want to stay in this, but I don't want to necessarily be doing this full time. And then among those who said, I'm not planning to retire at all, I still go back to the idea that much of that was driven by financial realities, that they weren't going to be able to do it. They just did not see a way to be able to stop doing what they have been doing and not receive compensation. They just weren't prepared for the retirement years.
Yeah. Lars, any follow-up to that?
Yeah. So, Jamie, in your mind, as kind of a researcher, what does that do to the future of our churches when we have ministers who can't retire, or what does it do to our churches to have ministers who are kind of holding on to their pulpits longer than maybe they should?
Well, that probably depends on how attractive their pulpit is. For some churches, very, very sad to say, I'm not sure anyone else wants the pulpit. And it may be that the church is on its way to kind of dying, just as demographically. Yeah. And this goes to the thought of, again, more in rural locations, because the demographics of that area have changed. The demographics of the church have changed, and it just reaches a point where the church may not be able to exist in the future. Now, in some of the more attractive pulpit locations, if someone says, I'm not going to retire because I'm not prepared to, or I don't want to, then that can sort of create a roadblock, I suppose, to those who are coming in behind and who are wanting to move into a bigger church, and I'm not quite sure how that would impact their view, but I would imagine it would be frustrating to some degree.
Yeah.
In your research on the generations thing, have you come into any information about, like, I've heard a lot of Christian colleges kind of bemoan that there's not a lot of people going into study ministry. And then I also hear churches often bemoaning that there's, open pulpits and there's no one to fill the pulpits. Do you have any, from a sociological research, do you have any thoughts on that? Or is that coming into any of the conversations that you're doing on the kind of aging?
I don't have anything in terms of research, but I do ponder this, that how many students how many kids who go to a Christian college to major in Bible, want to become a preacher, how many of them come out on the day of graduation with thousands and thousands of dollars of school loans? And okay, we have one,
Yeah.
and probably many others. And while their heart may be good and they really want to be in ministry, and they find a church of 120 who just are going to love them to death and be glad they're there and they can live in the parsonage, but they find they just can't afford that job. They just don't have enough money to service the debt on their school loans and pay for their living expenses and what they're doing. That's a completely different subject, but that's, I think, a deep concern. Is that some kids, while they are drawn to ministry, they kind of look at the financial realities and they realize, I can't leave this college with $50,000, $60,000, $70,000, $80,000 in school loans and go take a job that pays me $30,000 a year and gives me a house to live in. It just doesn't work.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, that's right. And man, there was something I was going to say, but it just left my mind. Lars, do you have anything to follow up with that while I try to remember?
No, that's good. Yeah. I mean, I think we want to pursue, further ways of asking that question. What is good ministry preparation?
Yeah.
You mentioned some, people coming to the pulpit later in life and things, having jobs that maybe have provided retirement for them. That kind of changes the picture. We're finding some success here in the Northwest with second career vocational pastors or semi-bivocational or co-vocational pastors who are coming to ministry later in life, but they don't need a sizable income. And in many ways, it's almost an addition to their Social Security or other things as they take on a church of 50 or 60 or even less. And whatever the church is able to pay is helpful to them in their retirement, but is not necessary for them to live on because they already own their house and have either a pension or Social Security or other forms of retirement. And so we're asking some questions about, is it the best model of ministry to have a 22-year-old show up to these pulpits where they may not be as prepared? And then on the other side, as I have a stake in the game with regards to education, could we pursue some assets, some ways to say that at the Christian college level, if you study vocational ministry, you don't come out with debt? And I think there's endowments at these Christian colleges, Bushnell included, that should be able to pursue that kind of a compensation model where we stop burdening 22-year-olds with mountains of debt if they're going to go into ministry full time. Wow. So I would love to see other people pursue that. I think we've talked a little bit about several ways in which more research needs to be done, and I'd hope that someone will pick up that mantle.
No, yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Lars. Like as one who was burdened with some debt and still has debt as a result of going to college to study Bible to be a minister, just kind of like I think back now, I'm like, what was I thinking? I should have done a different something. I mean, I still want to do ministry, but there's had to be a different way for me not to have all this debt on the back end of it and not really be able to pay it off very well within ministry itself. So I'm hoping for, hey, Joe Biden, please forgive my debt. But it also, it just seems like from the very beginning of the movement, disciples in the early, 19th century, it kind of seems like the ecclesiological setup itself failed within that first generation, where ministers were unable to support themselves, and elders were meant to be paid. Most churches couldn't pay them, and evangelists coming in, and there being some conflict there between elders and evangelists, and supporting evangelists, and evangelists not being able to continue that work because of lack of support, because congregations simply just couldn't. So there's something which I've kind of tried to explore in my paper and my research, in terms of what from our history has led to this moment where a lot of our pastors are where they're at in terms of retirement preparedness financially. But is there any parting wisdom, Dr. Knapp, or advice or encouragement that you would have for pastors and or churches within this context of the American DIY retirement crisis?
Well, I don't know that I have recommendations or sage advice. I think I have an observation. Yep. And this comes again from just talking with ministers who are close to retirement or have retired. When a preacher talks too much about money, he is seen as being greedy. And so it's a very, very fine line that preachers have to walk between, trying to be compensated at a level that's fair and that, allows them to cover the obligations they have. And so I think, because preachers have to walk that fine line, they need another voice. And some of the motivation for the two studies I did was to try to be the voice. I don't know how many people listened or read, but Jordan, I think you had picked up on the article that was published in the Christian Chronicle.
Mm-hmm. I did.
After I did the study, I contacted the Christian Chronicle and I gave them the information.
Okay.
Because they had published a story about the graying of the flock, and so we had already had a little bit of contact with one another. And so when I did this study, I contacted them and I said, hey, I just finished a study on, ministers in retirement. Do you have any interest in this? And they were very interested. And if you read that article, you see that there's a little bit of research in it, but they went out and made it more of a newspaper magazine article, which was mm-hmm. perfectly appropriate. They interviewed a few folks, put a few pictures in. And that's the sort of voice that needs to be given to this, because I think when an individual preacher starts saying, hey, I think I really need to be compensated more, well, they can get labeled as, being in it for the wrong reason. But when there's a voice that's trying to say to many, many, many churches or to a whole fellowship, look, we need to pay more attention to the way we're compensating those who've committed their life to ministry, and need to understand that they don't just work on Sundays. I mean, they're really, they're 7 day a week kind of folks. The minister, particularly at smaller churches, is pretty much doing everything: the weddings and the funerals, and they're working with the kids, and they're working with the, and we just need to be aware of that. And when they get too old to be able to hold a full-time position, or no church is interested in them, we can't just cast them aside. We've got to help them be prepared for those later years in life.
Yeah, and there is a definite correlation between the article they just came out with hey, where's all the pastors? Where's all the ministers? We've got these empty pulpits. There's a definite correlation between that article that just came out and what we're talking about today. And that's one of probably many reasons why perhaps Churches of Christ are at where they're at right now. All right, Dr. Knapp, thank you very much for being a part of this podcast episode with us tonight. Lars, do you have anything you want to say as we bid farewell?
Well, just incredibly grateful for you and for your work. And I would hope that you continue to push our universities to hire more researchers and sociologists, and keep doing what you're doing. I appreciate your work there. I'm looking forward to reading The Grain of the Flock and some other things that you've mentioned today too, just because I'm dealing with that cross-denominational right now with independent Christian churches, Churches of Christ and Disciples of Christ up here in the Northwest. And so keep writing on those things when it comes to aging. I think it's important work.
Well, thank you very much. I thank you for inviting me to be a part of your podcast, and I appreciate very much your work and encourage both of you to keep doing what you're doing, because I think you're doing wonderful and very important things that are going to be of benefit to many people.
We hope so, and we hope that this, along with what the Christian Chronicle has done and kind of giving a voice to your study several years ago, that this gives more of a voice to what you have done and what others may do in the future. So again, thank you very much. All right, guys. Yep. To our viewers and to our listeners, we'll see you next time on the Almost Essential podcast. Goodbye. Once again, thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Almost Essential podcast. If you like what you heard and you want to reach out, you can connect with me, Jordan Koss, on Facebook or Instagram. We hope this series is a valuable resource for you, pastor or otherwise. And remember, you are not almost essential. Your role and service in the church is essential, as well as saving for retirement within your holy vocation and calling.